Picture yourself now, standing in the bedchamber of a stone castle on a January night in the year 1347. The walls around you are 3 feet thick, but they offer no warmth, only mass. Your breath clouds before your face. The wind outside isn't just blowing, it's probing, searching for every crack in the shutters, every gap in the mortar, every weakness in this fortress of cold stone. You can hear it keening through the arrow slits, a low moan that never quite stops. The fire in the hearth has burned down to coals. Somewhere below you in the great hall there might still be warmth. But here in this chamber the cold is a physical presence. It settles on your skin like a damp cloth. It seeps into your bone. The romantic notion of castle life, the tapestries, the grandeur, the fairy tale dissolves in an instant. When you truly imagine what it meant to close your eyes in a room made of stone in the depths of winter. How did they do it? How did anyone sleep through a medieval winter in these fortresses without succumbing to the cold? The answer isn't simple, and it certainly isn't comfortable. Before we descend deeper into the bitter reality of medieval castle nights, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you're watching from somewhere warm right now, drop your location in the comments. I'm curious where this story finds you. Here's the blunt truth. Medieval castles were not designed for comfort. They were designed to withstand siege, to project power, to serve as military installations that happen to house human beings. Every architectural choice prioritized defense over warmth. Imagine yourself walking through the corridors of a typical 13th century castle in England or France. The stone beneath your feet is so cold it numbs your soles through your leather shoes. The walls are limestone or granite, materials that hold the chill of winter like a miser hoards gold. These walls breathe cold into the rooms they enclose. During the day they might absorb a fraction of warmth from the sun or from fires, but at nights they radiate that cold back into the living spaces with relentless efficiency. You step into a bedchamber perhaps belonging to a minor lord or a knight in the household. The room is small, which is actually an advantage. Smaller spaces are easier to heat, or rather less impossible to heat. But look up. The ceiling is high, perhaps 12 or 15 feet above you, because this room exists within a tower or a keep where defensive considerations dictated vertical space. All the warm air, what little exists, rises and pools uselessly near the rafters. The windows are narrow. If this is a defensive chamber, they might be nothing more than arrow slits, functional for archers, useless for light, and actively hostile to warmth. Shutters cover them, crude wooden boards that fit imperfectly into their frame. You can feel the draft even from across the room, a thin blade of frozen air that cuts through the darkness. Here's the plain fact. Glass windows were extraordinarily rare before the late medieval period and remained luxury items even then. What glass existed was thick, uneven, and set in small panes held together by lead. Most windows, even in noble chambers, were simply open holes in the wall that could be shuttered. And shutters, no matter how well made, always leaked air. The floor beneath you might be bare stone, or if you're fortunate, covered with rushes, dried reeds, and herbs scattered to provide a thin barrier against the cold radiating from below. In better chambers there might be woven mats, or even, in the grandest rooms, a carpet imported at vast expense from the east. But for most castle dwellers the floor was simply stone, ancient and cold and utterly indifferent to human comfort. Now, here's a quirky tidbit that historians love to debate. How effective were medieval fireplaces really? You're standing now in front of the hearth. It's a substantial feature built into the wall with a chimney that draws smoke upward, an innovation that only became common in the 12th and 13th. Before that, many castle halls used central hearths, with smoke simply rising to escape through vents in the ceiling or through the general porosity of the roof. The invention of the wall-mounted fireplace with a proper chimney was genuinely revolutionary. But here's what you notice immediately. The fireplace is massive, yet its warmth extends only a few feet into the room. You can feel the heat on your face if you stand directly in front of it. But take 2 steps back and the cold reasserts itself. The fire needs constant feeding. Wood was consumed in staggering quantities. A single large household might burn through several cords of wood per week in winter. A curious note from household accounts. Castles employed numerous servants whose primary job was fire maintenance. They hauled wood, tended fires through the night, cleaned out ashes and swept chimneys. In the account rolls of Edward I's castles there are detailed records of wood purchases and charcoal stockpiles. The logistics of staying warm were as complex as the logistics of defense. Imagine yourself now as one of the privileged, perhaps a lady of the household or a visiting nobleman. You have access to a brazier, a metal container filled with hot coals that can be moved from room to room. These were luxury items, often beautifully wrought in bronze or iron. You'd place your brazier near the bed carefully, because the risk of fire was genuine and terrifying. Stone walls don't burn, but everything else in a medieval chamber, the wooden furniture, the fabric hangings, the rushes on the floor, the bed itself, was supremely flammable. The smell in your chamber is complex. Wood smoke, certainly, but also the herbal scent of the rushes mixed with lavender or rue if you're wealthy enough to afford such niceties. There's the wool smell of the bed curtains and blankets. Damp wool, because everything in a medieval castle was slightly damp. Stone walls weep with condensation when the temperature differential is extreme enough. Here's where we arrive at the ingenious, desperate and utterly essential centerpiece of medieval sleep technology: the bed. Picture yourself now approaching what would have been a substantial investment for any household: a proper bedstead. This isn't the simple frame you're imagining. A medieval bed for someone of status was an elaborate construction, and every element served the singular purpose of trapping and preserving heat. The bed frame sits high off the floor, sometimes 2 or 3 feet above the ground. This elevation serves multiple purposes. It lifts the sleeper above the worst of the floor-level drafts. It also raises you above the domain of vermin, rats, mice and insects that prowl the floor rushes in the darkness. But the truly revolutionary element is the curtain. Imagine yourself standing before a bed that's entirely enclosed in heavy fabric, wool or thick linen, often multiple layers. These curtains hang from a wooden canopy frame that sits above the bed, creating what's essentially a small room within the room. You pull aside these curtains and step into a different microclimate. Inside the bed curtains, the air is warmer. Not warm, but warmer. Your breath, your body heat, the heat of anyone else sharing the bed, and beds were frequently shared. All of it is trapped by these fabric walls. The curtains block drafts. They create darkness, which was itself valuable in an era when night could be genuinely frightening. Here's the plain fact: a properly constructed bed with full curtains could raise the temperature inside by several degrees compared to the chamber outside. This doesn't sound like much, but when the ambient temperature in your stone chamber is hovering around freezing, those few degrees represent the difference between sleep and shivering wakefulness. You lie back in this imagined bed now, and beneath you there's a complex layering system. Ground floor chamber near the kitchens. If you're fortunate, your bed is a simple pallet, a cloth sack stuffed with straw laid on the floor. You might share a single thin blanket with another servant. The cold you experience is different, more severe, more constant, more dangerous. While the Lord sleeps in his curtained bed with wool blankets and perhaps a brazier, you wrap yourself in your cloak and hope the body warmth of the person beside you is enough to see you through the night. This wasn't considered cruel. This was the natural order. The medieval mind accepted hierarchy as divinely ordained, and the hierarchy of warmth simply reflected the broader social order. The peasants in the village beyond the castle walls had it worse still. sleeping in one-room cottages where the animals might be brought inside for their body heat, where the thatch roof leaked, and the wind found every crack in the wattle and daub walls. Scholars remain divided over whether medieval people simply had greater tolerance for cold, having never known anything else, or whether they suffered as acutely as we would. The truth probably lies in the middle. Certainly their bodies adapted. Medieval people were accustomed to temperature extremes that would debilitate us. But the sources also make clear that they recognized cold as an enemy, fought it with every resource available, and celebrated warmth when they could find it. Here's a detail from household accounts that tells you everything. The best rooms in any castle were those closest to the kitchen or above the great hall where fires burned longest. A chamber positioned over the kitchen where heat rose through the floor from the cooking fires below was a prize assignment. Architecture reflected this. High-status chambers were often positioned to take advantage of rising heat from lower rooms. Now imagine yourself lying awake in that medieval bed listening to the wind, feeling the cold pressing in despite all your defenses. The darkness around you is absolute. This is before electric lights, before gas lamps, before even reliable candles for the common person. Tallow candles and rushlights provide minimal illumination, and they're expensive enough that you don't waste them while sleeping. The darkness in a medieval chamber was profound. The kind of darkness we rarely experience anymore, where your hand before your face is invisible, where your eyes never adjust because there's simply nothing to adjust to. In this darkness, in this cold, your mind does what human minds have always done. It peoples the shadows with fears. The medieval mind believed in very real supernatural threats, demons, spirits, malevolent forces that prowled the night. The wind wasn't just wind. It was the sound of tormented souls or searching devils. That scratching sound might be a rat, or it might be something worse. This is why bed curtains served a psychological function beyond their practical warmth. They created a boundary, a protection, a defined space that was yours and safe. The curtains kept out more than drafts. They kept out the vast, threatening darkness of the night itself. Here's the blunt truth. Medieval people were afraid of the night in ways we struggle to comprehend. The cold intensified that fear. Winter nights were longer, darker, more dangerous. Fires could go out. You could wake to find the room so cold your water basin had frozen solid. And if something went wrong, if you became ill, if a fire started, if an enemy attacked, the cold would be an additional adversary. A curious note from 14th century French sources: physicians warned that sleeping in excessively cold conditions could lead to the accumulation of evil humors, and recommended that people of status ensure their chambers were adequately heated before bed. The medical theory was wrong, but the observation was sound. Cold made you sick, and everyone knew it. You wake now, and the ordeal isn't over, it's beginning again. Picture yourself in that curtained bed as pale winter light begins to filter through the shuttered windows. You've made it through the night, but now you face the morning challenge, leaving the relative warmth of the bed for the brutal cold of the chamber. This was no small thing. The bed is warm, not hot, but tolerably warm from your body heat in the blanket. The chamber beyond the curtains is freezing. Medieval sources make clear that people delayed this transition as long as possible. You might lie there gathering courage, mentally preparing for the shock. When you finally pull aside the curtain and emerge, the cold hits you like a physical blow. Your breath clouds immediately. The floor under your feet is like ice. If there was a fire overnight, it's dead now. Nothing but ash and perhaps a few faintly glowing embers. The first task is always to revive or rebuild the fire, and until that's accomplished, you're operating in conditions barely above freezing. Getting dressed is an urgent priority. Medieval people didn't have the casual loungewear we take for granted. You're pulling on multiple layers, a linen undertunic, a wool tunic over that, perhaps a robe or gown, wool hose, leather shoes. Every layer is cold until your body warms it. Your fingers fumble with laces and ties because they're already going numb. Here's the plain fact. Many medieval people, especially those of lower status, simply didn't fully undress for bed in winter. You'd remove your outer layers, certainly, but you might sleep in your undertunic and hose covered with your cloak. This meant you woke somewhat dressed already, reducing the trauma of mourning. Scholars still debate the significant variations in these experiences across the medieval period. And geography. A castle in Sicily faced different challenges than a castle in Scotland. Mediterranean castles might be cold at night in winter, but not lethally so. The morning sun brought genuine warmth. Northern castles, Norwegian, Scottish, Northern German, faced far more extreme conditions. Some northern castles incorporated architectural features like double walls or corridors that could be sealed off in winter to reduce the habitable space and concentrate warmth. The later medieval period, the 14th and 15th centuries, saw genuine improvement. Fireplaces became more sophisticated, chimneys drew better. The wealthy began to install glass windows, which for all their imperfections were vastly better than open shutters. Some castles even had heated rooms, chambers where flues from lower-level fires passed through the walls or under the floors, an ancient Roman technique rediscovered. But here's what you need to understand. For most of the medieval period, for most people living in castles, these improvements were marginal. The fundamental reality remained unchanged. You lived in a stone building in a cold climate without central heating, and winter was an endurance test you had to pass every year. A curious note from Icelandic sagas. Norse people, living in perhaps the harshest conditions of medieval Europe, developed extremely sophisticated bed warmth technology. Their beds were built into alcoves, sometimes with walls on 3 sides, minimizing heat loss. They used down-filled coverlets that remain impressive even by modern standards. When your survival depends on it, innovation follows necessity. Here's the blunt truth we've been circling. They endured it because they had no choice. There's a tendency in historical writing to explain away discomfort, to find ways medieval people didn't mind, or didn't notice the hardships they faced. But the sources don't support this. Medieval people complained about the cold. They wrote about it in letters, in diaries, in the margins of manuscripts. They took every measure they could afford to mitigate.